Marcus Chen had always been invisible in the corporate world of Meridian Industries. At 32, he worked as a mid-level analyst in a glass tower that scraped the Seattle sky, spending his days buried in spreadsheets while his colleagues climbed ladders he never seemed to find. Every morning, he watched the same ritual unfold in the office elevator. The senior executives would step in, their expensive suits crisp, their conversations flowing with confidence about deals worth millions. Marcus would press himself against the back wall, hoping they might notice his existence, perhaps acknowledge the reports he stayed late perfecting. But recognition never came. His supervisor, Janet Morrison, barely glanced at his work before stamping it with approval. His colleagues treated him like office furniture, pleasant enough but forgettable. During team meetings, Marcus would prepare thoughtful questions and innovative suggestions, only to watch others receive credit for ideas he had whispered in passing conversations. The frustration ate at him slowly, like acid on metal. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday morning in November. Marcus had spent 3 weeks developing a cost reduction strategy that could save the company $2 million annually. He had researched every detail, contacted suppliers, run financial models, and prepared a presentation that he believed would finally showcase his capabilities. The meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning, and Marcus arrived early, his hands slightly trembling as he set up his laptop. Janet walked in 15 minutes late, coffee in hand, followed by the department heads. She glanced at Marcus with the same distracted expression she gave the wall clock. "Right, Marcus has something to show us about cost savings. Make it quick, we have the quarterly review at 11. Marcus began his presentation, his voice gaining strength as he explained the data. The numbers were solid, the projections conservative, the implementation plan realistic. For 20 minutes, he laid out a strategy that could transform their department's efficiency. When he finished, the room fell silent. Marcus looked around the table, waiting for questions, feedback, anything that suggested they understood the significance of what he had presented. Janet nodded absently. "Interesting stuff, Marcus. We'll take it under consideration." She turned to her laptop, already moving to the next agenda item. The department heads shuffled their papers, clearly ready to discuss more pressing matters. Marcus stood there for a moment, watching his 3 weeks of work dissolve into corporate indifference. But something shifted in that moment of dismissal. Instead of the familiar sting of rejection, Marcus felt a strange clarity wash over him. He had been playing their game by their rules, seeking their validation, making their approval the measure of his worth. He had been excuse-making for years, telling himself that recognition would come if he just worked harder, stayed later, prepared better presentations. The truth hit him with startling simplicity: their opinion of his work had nothing to do with the quality of his work. After the meeting, Marcus returned to his desk and made a decision that would change everything. He opened his laptop and began drafting his resignation letter. Not out of defeat, but out of liberation. For the first time in his career, he was going to act based on his own assessment of his capabilities rather than seeking external validation. That afternoon, Marcus walked into the office of David Patterson, the CEO of a smaller consulting firm across town. He had no appointment, no introduction, no mutual connections. The receptionist tried to turn him away, explaining that Mr. Patterson was extremely busy and didn't take unscheduled meetings. Marcus looked at her with calm confidence and said, "Please tell Mr. Patterson that someone is here who can save his company $2 million this year. If he's too busy for that conversation, I understand." 10 minutes later, Marcus sat across from David Patterson in a corner office that was half the size of Janet's but felt twice as powerful. Patterson was in his 50s, with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. He listened without interruption as Marcus explained his cost reduction strategy, adapting it on the fly to Patterson's business model. When Marcus finished, Patterson leaned back in his chair. "Why aren't you implementing this at Meridian?" Patterson asked. Marcus met his gaze steadily. "Because they're not ready to hear solutions from someone they've already decided doesn't matter." Patterson smiled for the first time. "And you think I'm different?" "I think you're smart enough to recognize value regardless of where it comes from," Marcus replied. "But if I'm wrong, I'll know that in the next 5 minutes, and I'll move on to someone who is." The silence stretched between them. Patterson was testing him, waiting to see if Marcus would backtrack, qualify his statement, or seek approval. But Marcus had forsaken the need for validation. He sat quietly, his expression neutral, prepared to accept whatever decision Patterson made without pleading his case further. "You're hired," Patterson said finally. "Start Monday. Your title is Director of Operations. Your first project is implementing that cost reduction strategy. Your salary is 60% higher than whatever Meridian was paying you." Marcus felt no surge of triumph, no desperate gratitude. He simply nodded. "Thank you. I'll see you Monday at 8. As he walked back to Meridian to submit his resignation, Marcus reflected on what had just happened. He hadn't changed his skills, his experience, or his qualifications. He had simply stopped seeking validation and making excuses. He had presented his value without apology and accepted the outcome without emotional investment. The difference was profound. At Meridian, Janet looked genuinely surprised when Marcus handed her his resignation letter. "But, Marcus, where will you go? What about your career path here? Don't you want to discuss this with HR first?" Marcus recognized the questions for what they were, attempts to make him doubt his decision, to seek validation for his choice. 6 months ago, he would have spent an hour explaining his reasoning, seeking her understanding, perhaps even asking for her advice. Now he simply said, "My last day is Friday. I'll make sure all my projects are properly documented for transition." Janet's surprise turned to something approaching respect. "Well, I wish you luck, Marcus. You've always been reliable." Reliable. The word that had once felt like faint praise now seemed irrelevant. Marcus had been seeking adjectives from people whose opinions held no real weight in his life. He had been making excuses for their lack of vision rather than trusting his own assessment of his worth. That evening, Marcus sat in his small apartment overlooking Elliott Bay. The city lights reflected off the dark water, and he felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years. Tomorrow he would begin the process of proving to himself what he was capable of, not to impress others but to satisfy his own standards of excellence. He thought about Machiavelli's observation that men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand. People see what they expect to see based on presentation and confidence, not necessarily on merit. But Machiavelli also understood that true power comes from competence backed by unshakable self-knowledge. Marcus had spent years being competent while seeking external validation. Now he was ready to be competent while validating himself. The phone rang. It was his mother, calling for their weekly conversation. "How was work today, honey?" "I quit my job and got hired for a better one," Marcus said simply. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Marcus wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, his mother spoke. "Marcus, that doesn't sound like you at all. Are you sure you thought this through? What if the new job doesn't work out? What if you made a mistake leaving Meridian? You've been there for 6 years." Marcus listened to the familiar litany of concerns, the implicit message that he should have sought approval, planned more carefully, considered all the risks. 6 months ago, he would have spent the conversation justifying his decision, seeking her validation, perhaps even second-guessing himself. Now he simply said, "I'm sure it was the right decision, Mom. I'll talk to you next week." After hanging up, Marcus realized that the need for validation extended far beyond his professional life. He had been seeking approval from family, friends, colleagues, even strangers, allowing their comfort levels to define his possibilities. He had been making excuses for playing small, telling himself that caution was wisdom and that gradual progress was more sustainable than bold action. But sustainable progress toward what? A life of reliable mediocrity? A career of being overlooked and undervalued? A personal identity built on other people's limited vision of what he could become? Marcus opened his laptop and began researching Patterson's company more thoroughly. He wanted to understand not just the immediate challenge he would face but the broader opportunities for growth and impact. He wasn't planning to impress Patterson, he was planning to challenge himself to perform at a level that would satisfy his own increasingly demanding standards. As he worked late into the night, Marcus felt the quiet force building within him. It wasn't aggression or ambition in the traditional sense. It was something more powerful, complete self-reliance combined with absolute commitment to excellence. He was no longer interested in being liked, noticed, or validated. He was interested in being effective. The realization came with startling clarity. For years, he had been asking the wrong question. Instead of how can I get them to see my value, he should have been asking how can I create value so undeniable that their recognition becomes irrelevant. This shift in perspective changed everything. When you stop seeking validation, you stop making excuses for other people's limitations. When you stop making excuses, you start taking complete responsibility for your results. When you take complete responsibility, you develop the quiet force that commands authentic respect. Marcus closed his laptop at 2 a.m, feeling more energized than he had in months. Monday would be the beginning of a new chapter, not just in his career but in his understanding of personal power. He was done asking for permission to be excellent. He was done explaining his worth to people who couldn't see it. He was done making excuses for playing at a level beneath his capabilities. The city below had grown quiet, but Marcus felt wide awake. He was finally ready to discover what he could accomplish when he stopped seeking external validation and started building internal conviction. The quiet force was stirring, and Marcus knew that everything was about to change. He thought back to that morning's meeting, to Janet's dismissive nod and the department head's distracted shuffling of papers. They had given him a gift without realizing it. They had shown him that seeking validation from people who couldn't recognize value was a waste of energy that could be better spent creating more value. Marcus smiled as he prepared for bed. Tomorrow would be his last day at Meridian Industries. On Monday, he would begin the real work of his life, proving to himself what he was truly capable of achieving. The validation he sought had been within his power to give all along. He just hadn't been ready to claim it. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp November air that promised winter. Marcus stood outside Patterson and Associates at 7:30, watching the building come alive with the day's first workers. He wasn't nervous, which surprised him. 6 months ago, starting a new job would have sent his anxiety through the roof. He would have arrived an hour early, rehearsed conversations in his head, worried about making the right impression. Now he felt calm, focused, ready to work. David Patterson met him in the lobby at 8 sharp, extending a firm handshake. "Ready to save me $2 million? "Ready to save you more than that," Marcus replied. "I've been thinking about the broader applications." Patterson raised an eyebrow as they entered the elevator. "Already?" Marcus had spent the weekend analyzing Patterson's entire operation, not to impress his new boss but to satisfy his own curiosity about the challenges ahead. He had identified 17 areas where efficiency improvements could compound into significant cost savings. But, more importantly, he had discovered 3 untapped revenue opportunities that could dwarf the cost reductions. "I'll have a comprehensive analysis ready by Thursday," Marcus said. "But, the short version is that you're sitting on opportunities you haven't recognized yet." Patterson's corner office was busy that morning, with project managers dropping off reports and senior consultants briefing him on client challenges. Marcus watched the interactions carefully, not to judge or criticize, but to understand the patterns of communication and decision-making. He noticed that Patterson listened more than he spoke, asked specific questions rather than general ones, and made decisions quickly once he had the information he needed. After the morning briefings, Patterson turned his attention to Marcus. "Your office is down the hall. Sarah will show you around and get you set up with everything you need. We have a staff meeting at 2 where you'll meet the team." "Questions?" "Just one," Marcus said. "What results do you expect to see, and by when?" Patterson smiled. "I like that question. I expect to see your cost reduction strategy fully implemented within 90 days. I expect a detailed report on additional opportunities within 30 days. And I expect you to challenge assumptions around here, including mine." Marcus nodded. "Understood." As Sarah led him to his new office, Marcus reflected on how different this felt from his experience at Meridian. Patterson hadn't given him a lengthy orientation about company culture, warned him about office politics, or outlined the approval processes for new initiatives. He had been hired to produce results, given clear expectations, and trusted to figure out the how. Marcus's office was modest but functional, with a window overlooking the city and enough space for the work ahead. As he unpacked his laptop and notebooks, he felt the quiet force that had been building within him settle into focused determination. He wasn't here to prove himself worthy of Patterson's respect. He was here to solve problems and create value. The respect would be a byproduct, not the goal. The first challenge came before lunch. Marcus was reviewing the company's vendor contracts when he discovered a pattern of cost increases that seemed disconnected from market conditions. 3 major suppliers had raised their prices by 15 to 20% over the past year, but the increases appeared to be coordinated and unjustified. Marcus suspected that someone at Patterson and Associates was either incompetent in their vendor management or actively benefiting from the inflated costs. 6 months ago, Marcus would have agonized over how to handle this discovery. He would have worried about stepping on toes, offending colleagues, or appearing too aggressive in his new role. He might have spent weeks gathering more evidence or seeking advice on the proper way to raise such concerns. But Marcus had forsaken the need for validation and forsworn excuses. He had been hired to solve problems, and this was clearly a problem. Marcus walked to Patterson's office and knocked on the open door. "Do you have 5 minutes?" "What did you find?" Patterson asked, gesturing to a chair. Marcus laid out the vendor contract analysis, showing the pattern of price increases and the lack of competitive bidding for major purchases. Someone is either not doing their job or actively working against the company's interests. Either way, it's costing you approximately $400,000 annually. Patterson studied the documents carefully. "Who handles vendor relationships?" "Tom Brennan in procurement." Patterson's expression remained neutral, but Marcus caught the slight tightening around his eyes. "Tom's been with us for 8 years. He's always been reliable." Marcus recognized the implicit test. Patterson was waiting to see if he would backtrack, soften his assessment, or defer to the judgment of someone with longer tenure. But Marcus had learned to trust his analysis over other people's comfort levels. "The numbers don't lie," Marcus said simply. "Tom may be a good person, but he's either incompetent at vendor management or he's taking kickbacks. Based on the pattern, I suspect the latter." The silence stretched between them. Marcus didn't fill it with qualifications or apologies. He had presented his findings and his assessment. Whatever Patterson decided to do with that information was beyond Marcus's control. "I'll handle Tom," Patterson said finally. "What's your recommendation for immediate action?" Marcus pulled out his laptop and opened a spreadsheet. "I've identified replacement vendors for all 3 contracts. We can save 30% on the office supplies contract, 25% on the IT services contract, and 15% on the facilities maintenance contract. The transition can be completed within 2 weeks if we move quickly." Patterson leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus with new interest. "You did all this research in 4 hours?" "I did enough research to make an informed recommendation," Marcus replied. "I can provide more detailed analysis if you need it, but the core numbers are solid." "Do it," Patterson said. "Handle the vendor transitions personally. I'll deal with Tom this afternoon." Marcus walked back to his office feeling the satisfaction of work well done, but without the desperate need for approval that had once defined his professional life. He had identified a problem, proposed a solution, and received authorization to act. The process had been clean, efficient, and based entirely on merit rather than politics or personality. The staff meeting that afternoon proved more challenging. Marcus found himself facing 12 experienced consultants and project managers who had been with the company for years. Tom Brennan was notably absent, and word had already spread that changes were coming to the procurement department. The tension in the room was palpable. Patterson introduced Marcus briefly, mentioning his background and his initial projects. "Marcus has identified some immediate opportunities for cost reduction and process improvement. He'll be working with all of you over the coming weeks to implement these changes." Sandra Webb, a senior consultant in her 40s, spoke first. Tom Brennan was a friend to everyone here. I hope you're not planning to come in and start firing people who've built this company. Marcus felt the familiar challenge in her tone, the implicit demand that he justify his actions and seek the group's approval for his approach. 6 months ago, he would have spent 10 minutes explaining his reasoning, emphasizing his respect for the team's experience, and asking for their cooperation. Now he simply said, "I'm here to solve problems and improve results." If that threatens anyone, they should probably examine why. The room fell silent. Sandra's face flushed red, and several other team members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Marcus had committed the social sin of refusing to seek their validation, of declining to apologize for doing his job effectively. Patterson watched the exchange with interest. "Marcus, why don't you walk the team through what you found so far?" For the next 20 minutes, Marcus presented his analysis of the vendor contracts, the process improvements he was implementing, and the additional opportunities he had identified. He spoke without defensiveness or aggression, simply laying out facts and recommendations. When team members asked questions, he answered them directly and completely. When they challenged his assumptions, he provided additional data to support his conclusions. The shift in the room's energy was gradual but unmistakable. Marcus wasn't trying to win them over or make them like him. He was treating them as professionals capable of understanding objective analysis and acting on sound recommendations. The respect he commanded wasn't based on charisma or political skill, it was based on competence and unshakable confidence in his work. After the meeting, Patterson walked with Marcus to the elevator. "You handled that well. Sandra was testing you." "I know," Marcus replied. "But I wasn't taking the test." Patterson laughed. "What do you mean?" "She was asking whether I would seek the team's approval for doing my job. That's not a test I'm interested in passing. Either my work speaks for itself or it doesn't." As the elevator doors closed, Marcus reflected on how much his perspective had changed. He was no longer playing the game of office politics, no longer seeking to be liked or accepted by colleagues who might or might not share his commitment to excellence. He was focused on results, period. The next few weeks proved this approach to be remarkably effective. Marcus implemented the vendor contract renegotiations, saving the company exactly as much as he had projected. He streamlined 3 administrative processes that were consuming unnecessary time and resources. He identified a client billing error that had been costing the company $15,000 monthly for over a year. Each success built his reputation within the organization, but Marcus noticed that the respect he commanded was different from the approval he had once sought. People didn't necessarily like his directness or his unwillingness to engage in the social rituals that usually accompanied workplace relationships. But they trusted his competence and relied on his judgment. The transformation became most apparent during a client crisis in early December. Patterson and Associates had been hired to restructure a struggling manufacturing company, but the client was pushing back against the recommended changes. The project was at risk of failing, which would damage the firm's reputation and cost them a significant fee. The senior consultant assigned to the project, Mike Harrison, was struggling to convince the client's leadership team to accept the restructuring plan. Mike was well-liked, politically savvy, and experienced in client relations. But he was also seeking the client's approval rather than insisting on the changes necessary for their success. Patterson called Marcus into his office on a Thursday afternoon. "I'm thinking of putting you on the Wellington manufacturing account. Mike's having trouble getting them to move forward with our recommendations." Marcus had been watching the situation from a distance, noting how Mike was making excuses for the client's resistance rather than addressing it directly. "What exactly do they object to?" "The layoffs," Patterson said. "We're recommending they eliminate 30% of their workforce to remain viable. The CEO doesn't want to be seen as the bad guy. And Mike is trying to find alternatives that avoid the layoffs? Mike is trying to make the CEO comfortable with the decision." Marcus saw the problem immediately. Mike was seeking validation from a client who was more interested in avoiding difficult decisions than saving his company. The CEO wanted to feel good about himself more than he wanted to solve his business problems. I'll take the account, Marcus said. But, I'll handle it my way. Patterson nodded. Which is? I'll present the facts clearly, explain the consequences of inaction, and let them choose their outcome. I won't make them comfortable with reality, but I'll make reality impossible to ignore. The next morning, Marcus walked into Wellington Manufacturing's headquarters with a folder containing updated financial projections and a simple ultimatum. He met with CEO Robert Wellington and his leadership team in a conference room overlooking their struggling production facility. Gentlemen, Marcus began, you hired us to save your company. We've identified what needs to be done. The question now is whether you want to implement our recommendations or wait for bankruptcy to make the decisions for you. Wellington shifted uncomfortably. Surely there must be alternatives to laying off a third of our people. Marcus opened his folder and laid out a single sheet of paper. Here are your options. Option 1, implement the layoffs, restructure your operations, and emerge as a profitable company that employs 70% of your current workforce. Option 2, avoid the layoffs and close the entire company within 18 months, employing 0% of your current workforce. The silence in the room was deafening. Marcus didn't fill it with explanations, qualifications, or attempts to make Wellington feel better about his situation. He had presented the facts and the choices clearly. The decision was Wellington's to make. Those are really the only options? Wellington asked finally. Those are the only options that involve staying in business, Marcus replied. Wellington looked around the table at his management team, seeking support for a decision he didn't want to make. Marcus recognized the familiar pattern, a leader seeking validation for avoiding responsibility. But Marcus had forsaken the role of providing such comfort. I need time to think about this, Wellington said. Marcus closed his folder and stood up. You have 48 hours to decide. After that, we're withdrawing our recommendation and terminating our contract. You can implement the restructuring plan or find another consulting firm willing to help you feel good about going out of business. The drive back to Patterson's office gave Marcus time to reflect on what had just happened. He had delivered an ultimatum to a client, something that would have terrified him 6 months earlier. But he had also done something more important. He had refused to enable Wellington's avoidance of necessary decisions. Patterson was waiting in his office when Marcus returned. How did it go? We'll know in 48 hours, Marcus said. Either they'll accept reality or they'll find someone else to validate their denial. Patterson smiled. You realize that's not how client relations usually work. I know, Marcus replied. But I've discovered that treating people like adults capable of making hard decisions gets better results than treating them like children who need to be protected from uncomfortable truths. The call came 36 hours later. Wellington had accepted the restructuring plan in full and was ready to begin implementation immediately. Mike Harrison looked stunned when Patterson announced that the client had agreed to everything they had originally recommended. How did you get them to say yes? Mike asked Marcus later. I stopped trying to get them to say yes, Marcus replied. I gave them accurate information and let them choose their outcome. People respect honest assessment more than comfortable lies. As December progressed, Marcus's reputation within Patterson and Associates continued to evolve. He was known as someone who delivered results without drama, who spoke truth without malice, who commanded respect through competence rather than charm. The quiet force that had been building within him was now visible to everyone around him, even though he never spoke about it directly. The transformation was complete, but Marcus understood that it was also ongoing. Each day brought new opportunities to choose between seeking validation and creating value, between making excuses and taking responsibility, between playing small to make others comfortable and performing at his highest level regardless of their comfort. Marcus had learned that respect cannot be demanded or negotiated. It must be earned through consistent demonstration of competence, integrity, and self-reliance. The quiet force that commands respect isn't about being louder or more aggressive. It's about being more certain of your own worth and more committed to your own standards of excellence. As the year drew to a close, Marcus looked back on the transformation with satisfaction but without sentimentality. He had become the person he was always capable of being. He had simply stopped asking for permission and started taking responsibility. The validation he had sought from others had been within his power to give himself all along. The new year brought Marcus's greatest challenge yet, though it arrived disguised as an opportunity. Patterson and Associates had been invited to bid on a massive contract with Titanium Dynamics, a struggling aerospace company that needed a complete operational overhaul. The contract was worth $12 million over 2 years, more than Patterson's firm had ever handled. It was also a project that could either establish them as a major player in corporate restructuring or destroy their reputation if they failed. Marcus sat in Patterson's office on a gray January morning, reviewing the preliminary proposal materials. Titanium Dynamics employed 8,000 people across 3 facilities. They were hemorrhaging money, losing contracts to competitors, and facing potential bankruptcy within 2 years. The scope of the required changes was staggering. Every major consulting firm in the region is bidding on this, Patterson said. McKinsey, Bain, Deloitte. They all have 10 times our resources and 50 times our name recognition. Marcus looked up from the documents. Are you asking me to make excuses for why we shouldn't win this contract? Patterson laughed. I'm asking for your honest assessment of our chances. Our chances depend on what Titanium Dynamics actually wants, Marcus replied. If they want a prestigious firm name to impress their board, we'll lose. If they want results, we'll win. What makes you so confident? Marcus had spent the weekend researching Titanium Dynamics' history, financial statements, and market position. More importantly, he had studied their leadership team and identified the core problems that were killing the company. The issues weren't complex or mysterious. They were the predictable result of avoiding difficult decisions for too long. Because I know what's wrong with them, and I know how to fix it, Marcus said. The question is whether they're ready to hear the truth. The bidding process for the Titanium Dynamics contract stretched over 6 weeks. Marcus found himself leading Patterson's proposal team, working with 3 senior consultants to develop a comprehensive restructuring plan. It was the largest project he had ever managed, but Marcus approached it with the same methodical confidence he brought to every challenge. The first surprise came during the initial client meeting. Marcus had expected to present to Titanium's CEO and perhaps a few senior executives. Instead, he found himself facing the entire board of directors, including 3 external investors who were considering pulling their funding if dramatic improvements weren't achieved quickly. Marcus looked around the table at 15 faces, noting the mixture of skepticism, desperation, and barely concealed hostility. These were people accustomed to being courted by prestigious consulting firms, to presentations filled with impressive credentials and reassuring promises. Patterson and Associates was clearly the underdog in this competition. CEO Amanda Stone opened the meeting with a blunt assessment. Gentlemen, we're not here to waste time. Our company is dying. We need someone who can tell us exactly what's wrong and exactly how to fix it. We've heard from 3 firms already. Convince us you're different. Marcus recognized the challenge in her tone, but he also heard something else: exhaustion. Stone was tired of presentations that promised everything and delivered nothing. She wanted substance, not style. Marcus opened his laptop and projected a single slide onto the conference room screen. You have 4 fundamental problems, Marcus began. First, your production costs are 37% higher than your competitors because you're operating with 1990s efficiency in a 2025 market. Second, you're spending 43% of your revenue on administrative overhead that adds no value to your products. Third, your quality control processes are so bureaucratic that you're missing delivery deadlines on 60% of your contracts. Fourth, your management structure has 17 layers between the shop floor and decision makers, which means problems take months to surface and solutions take months to implement. The silence in the room was complete. Marcus had just delivered a devastating assessment of their operations without softening the blow or seeking their emotional comfort. Board member Thomas Kruger leaned forward, his expression hostile. Young man, you've been studying our company for what, a few weeks? We've been running this business for 30 years. Don't you think you're being somewhat arrogant? 6 months ago, Marcus would have backtracked immediately, apologizing for his directness and seeking to restore harmony. Now he met Kruger's gaze calmly. "Mr. Kruger, how has 30 years of experience worked out for you? Your stock price has dropped 60% in 3 years, you're losing market share to companies half your size, and you're 6 months away from bankruptcy. Either my assessment is accurate, or your experience is irrelevant. Which would you prefer to believe?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, clearly shocked by Marcus's refusal to defer to Kruger's seniority. But Amanda Stone was watching Marcus with new interest. "Assuming your assessment is correct," Stone said, "what's your proposed solution?" Marcus clicked to his next slide, which showed a reorganization chart that eliminated 11 of the 17 management layers. "We restructure your operations around results rather than hierarchy. We eliminate every position that doesn't directly contribute to production, delivery, or sales. We implement automated quality control systems that catch problems in hours rather than weeks. And we create direct communication channels between your production teams and your executive staff." "That would eliminate nearly 3,000 positions," board member Sarah Chen observed. "It would eliminate 3,000 positions that are preventing the remaining 5,000 from being successful," Marcus replied. "The alternative is eliminating all 8,000 positions when the company fails." Marcus spent the next hour walking through his detailed analysis, showing exactly how each change would impact productivity, costs, and market competitiveness. He didn't try to minimize the disruption or make the board feel comfortable about difficult decisions. He presented facts, projections, and clear implementation timelines. When he finished, Amanda Stone asked the question Marcus had been expecting. "Mr. Chen, the other firms we've spoken with have suggested more gradual approaches, phased implementations that would preserve more jobs and cause less disruption. What's your response to that?" Marcus had anticipated this comparison. The prestigious firms were selling comfort, not solutions. They were telling Titanium's leadership what they wanted to hear rather than what they needed to hear. "Ms. Stone, gradual change is what got you into this situation. You've been making incremental adjustments for years while your competitors revolutionized their operations. You don't have time for gradual improvement. You need dramatic transformation, and that requires dramatic action." "And if we're not ready for such dramatic action?" Kruger asked. Marcus closed his laptop and gathered his materials. "Then, you should hire one of the other firms. They'll make you feel better about going out of business." The meeting ended without clear resolution, but Marcus felt satisfied with his presentation. He had been honest about the challenges, specific about the solutions, and unwavering about the urgency. He had not sought their approval or tried to make them comfortable with reality. He had simply presented reality and let them choose their response. 3 days later, Patterson called Marcus into his office with an expression that mixed triumph with disbelief. "We won the contract." Marcus felt a moment of satisfaction, but not the desperate validation-seeking gratitude he might have experienced 6 months earlier. He had done good work, presented it honestly, and received the outcome his competence deserved. "When do we start?" Marcus asked. "Monday. Amanda Stone wants you to personally manage the implementation. She said something about appreciating your refreshing honesty." The Titanium Dynamics restructuring proved to be the most challenging project of Marcus's career. Over the next 18 months, he spent 3 days each week at their facilities, working directly with production teams, department heads, and executive staff to implement the operational changes he had proposed. The resistance was intense and immediate. Middle managers whose positions were being eliminated spread rumors about Marcus's motives and competence. Union representatives organized protests against the layoffs. Local media painted the restructuring as heartless corporate greed. Marcus found himself at the center of a storm of criticism and hostility. But Marcus had learned not to seek validation from people whose approval was irrelevant to his actual performance. He focused on results, not rhetoric. He measured progress by productivity improvements, cost reductions, and quality metrics, not by how many people liked his approach. The breakthrough came in month 6, when Titanium Dynamics delivered their first major contract ahead of schedule and under budget in over 2 years. The client was so impressed that they immediately awarded Titanium an additional contract worth $40 million. Word spread quickly through the industry, and other clients began reaching out with new opportunities. By month 12, Titanium's stock price had doubled. They were hiring new employees to handle increased demand. The workers who had survived the restructuring were earning higher wages and working in more efficient facilities. The company that had been 6 months from bankruptcy was now being discussed as an acquisition target by industry leaders. Amanda Stone called Marcus into her office on a Friday afternoon in late spring. "I want to offer you a position as Chief Operating Officer," she said. "Full executive package, equity participation, board membership. You've earned it." Marcus considered the offer seriously. It was everything he might have dreamed about 18 months earlier: prestige, security, recognition, financial reward. But he realized that these external markers of success no longer motivated him the way they once had. "I appreciate the offer," Marcus said, "but I'm not interested in managing someone else's vision. I'm ready to build my own." Stone looked surprised. "Your own consulting firm?" "My own approach to business transformation. I've learned that most companies don't fail because of market conditions or competitive pressure. They fail because their leaders are more interested in being comfortable than being effective." Marcus had been developing this philosophy throughout his work at Titanium. He had observed that the most successful changes occurred when leaders stopped seeking validation for difficult decisions and started taking responsibility for necessary outcomes. The quiet force that commanded respect wasn't about personality or charisma. It was about unwavering commitment to truth and results. That evening, Marcus met with David Patterson to discuss his future plans. Patterson had watched Marcus's transformation with professional admiration and personal pride. The uncertain analyst who had walked into his office 18 months earlier had become a confident leader capable of managing complex transformations. "You realize you're walking away from more money than you've ever been offered," Patterson said. "I'm walking toward more satisfaction than I've ever experienced," Marcus replied. "Money follows value creation. If I focus on creating real value, the money will take care of itself." Marcus's resignation from Patterson and Associates was effective at the end of June. He had saved the firm over $4 million through various initiatives, generated new business worth $8 million, and established a reputation that would benefit them for years. But, more importantly, he had proven to himself that his worth wasn't dependent on external validation. The launch of Marcus Chin Consulting was deliberately low-key. No impressive office, no expensive marketing, no publicity campaign. Marcus rented a small space above a coffee shop and furnished it with a desk, 2 chairs, and a whiteboard. His entire business strategy fit on a single page: help companies face reality and implement necessary changes without seeking approval from people who prefer comfortable lies. His first client came through word of mouth. The CEO of a struggling retail chain had heard about Marcus's work at Titanium Dynamics and wanted someone who would tell him the truth about his company's problems. Within 6 months, Marcus had helped them restructure their operations and return to profitability. The second client came through the first client's recommendation. Then, the third through the second. Marcus discovered that there was significant demand for honest assessment and practical solutions, even if they required difficult decisions. A year after launching his consulting practice, Marcus was working with 6 clients simultaneously, had hired 2 associates, and was turning away more business than he accepted. His approach to client selection was rigorous. He only worked with leaders who were genuinely committed to change rather than seeking validation for avoiding change. The transformation was complete, but Marcus understood that it was also ongoing. Each day brought opportunities to choose between seeking approval and creating value, between making excuses and taking responsibility, between playing small to make others comfortable and performing at his highest level regardless of their comfort. Marcus had learned that the quiet force that commands respect isn't about being louder, more aggressive, or more demanding. It's about being more certain of your own standards and more committed to meeting them consistently. When you forsake the need for external validation and forswear the temptation to make excuses, you develop an inner authority that others recognize and respect instinctively. On a December evening 2 years after leaving Meridian Industries, Marcus sat in his office reviewing the year's accomplishments. His consulting practice had generated $3 million in revenue. His clients had collectively saved over $20 million through his recommendations. He had been invited to speak at industry conferences and had been profiled in business magazines. But the external recognition wasn't what satisfied him most. What satisfied him was the knowledge that he had become the person he was always capable of being. He had stopped asking for permission to be excellent and started demanding it of himself. He had stopped seeking validation from others and started providing it for himself. The phone rang, interrupting his reflection. It was Amanda Stone from Titanium Dynamics. "Marcus, I have a proposition for you," she said. "We're considering acquiring 2 smaller companies, but we want your assessment of their operations before we proceed. Are you interested?" Marcus smiled as he opened his calendar. The work continued, and each new challenge was an opportunity to demonstrate that competence combined with unwavering self-reliance created a form of power that no external authority could grant or remove. He had forsaken validation and forsworn excuses. In return, he had gained something far more valuable: complete confidence in his own judgment and absolute commitment to his own standards of excellence. The quiet force that commands respect had been within him all along. He had simply needed to stop seeking permission to claim it. The transformation from invisible analyst to respected consultant hadn't required him to change his fundamental nature. It had only required him to stop compromising his potential to accommodate other people's limitations. Marcus had learned that respect isn't something you can demand or negotiate. It's something you earn by consistently demonstrating that your commitment to truth and results exceeds your need for comfort and approval. As he prepared to leave the office, Marcus reflected on Machiavelli's insight that true power comes from competence backed by unshakable self-knowledge. For years, he had possessed the competence but lacked the self-knowledge. He had been seeking external confirmation of his worth rather than trusting his own assessment. Now he understood that the validation he had sought from others had always been within his power to give. The respect he commanded wasn't based on others' opinions of his work, it was based on his own unwavering commitment to excellence. The quiet force that had transformed his life hadn't come from changing who he was. It had come from finally becoming willing to be who he had always been capable of being. Marcus turned off the lights and locked his office, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to demonstrate that forsaking validation and forswearing excuses wasn't just a professional strategy. It was a way of life that created authentic power, genuine respect, and lasting satisfaction. The quiet force would continue to grow because it was rooted in something no external circumstance could diminish: complete self-reliance and absolute commitment to truth.